Our last paper of the session, turning to a very interesting topic, a little bit different from the prior two, which were more fundamental vision phenomena characterization. We're going to welcome Martyn Gates to join us. Martyn is going to speak to the perceptual mechanisms that permit human beings to detect photorealism and computer-generated imagery. Martyn had a long career in industry before he has more recently joined Ravensbourne in the UK in the academic setting. So everyone please welcome Martyn to the stage.
Okay, sorry about the delayed start. So for the purposes of this presentation, it's going to be assumed that computer-generated photorealistic moving images will reach a point where they are indistinguishable from real images. This assumption will be considered in the context of television news and factual broadcasting, particularly in this emerging post-truth fake news world. What does it mean for us as a broadcasting community when human viewers and possibly computer and machine vision systems will not be able to discriminate between real and CGI video? What might be the epistemological and technical challenges for governments, broadcasters, and viewers? So, in my paper, I present a lot of background data. This presentation is about setting up the problem statement and then looking at the human visual perception with computer vision and machine vision, and then a summary and conclusion. So, Aristotle said, if sight is perception, then the objects of sight are objects of perception. Translating that to a contemporary television paradigm, we might say, if seeing is believing, then the seeing of television content is the believing of television content. The critical review is of research in this field and some of my exploratory research. Factors are behavioral, cognitive, and machine learning. By real versus generated, what I mean by here is camera-acquired images versus 3D CGI. And the news and factual broadcasting element is including the rise of fake news via broadcast channels, websites, and social media platforms. So, where does our story begin? I could go back to early storytelling and the human appetite for news. However, we'll begin with chemical stills photography in 1826, followed thereafter by the non-moving moving image and temporal sampling. Then we enter the age of photoelectric communications around about 1881. We then have the age of broadcasting around 1926. The birth of the information age in 1948, and not in the 1970s, 80s or 90s, the age of the digital image. The first digital image that was scanned and captured was in 1957. And then finally, we enter the era of generated moving images. In parallel with this very brief historical timeline, we can map the ability to deceive, to manipulate, to create, to hoax, propagandize, and to fake. One of the first known manipulated images dates from 1871. I certainly couldn't find any earlier examples of faked images. And this relates to the Paris Commune. So although this photo and others were based on real events, the photos are fakes. And not by the government, but by a royalist sympathizer who attended the trials of the communards and took their portraits in the courtroom. Then he hired actors to recreate firing squads, pasting the faces from the trial photos onto the restaged scene. The photos were effective as political propaganda, and the government had to ban them. Did this establish, perhaps, a trend that continues through evolutions of technology to current times? We see the development of removing people from history in the photographic medium. For example, Nikolai Yevtsov, who was Stalin's head of secret police, was executed in 1940. and he was airbrushed out of photographs on Stalin's orders. How many of you are familiar with this image? All right. Now, the question is this fake? Is this real? Or don't we know? Well, upon analysis, mistakes here, Photoshop mistakes, reveal horizontal and vertical flipping of certain image elements. The answer is this image was doctored. It's faked. It's not the original image that was released by Associated Press. And so what are the issues that I'm talking about? Not just beyond faking text, photographs and video. Is it simply a trust issue? Or is it now more of an epistemological issue? A recent study by the Worlds of Journalism stated that the range of journalistic epistemology relates to the accessibility of reality and the nature of acceptable evidence. The left-hand photo shows a British soldier gesturing to a crowd of Iraqi civilians near Basra. And this was run on the front page of the Los Angeles Times and the Hartford Courant on March the 30th, 2003. It had been taken the previous day by LA Times photographer Brian Wolski. It was noticed by someone at the Courant that certain elements, particularly people in the crowd, were replicated. They contacted Wolski, and Wolski admitted that the photo was actually a composite of the middle and right-hand photos. The LA Times fired him. This revelation of altered images in a news context created enormous amount of media attention, partly because it was the respected LA Times, but partly because it showed the capabilities of manipulating images in the field, in this context, in a war zone. The middle image is of 4 missiles, and this image was released by Sepah News, who are the media arm of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. 2 major sections, circled in red, appear to closely replicate other sections, which are circled in magenta. The photo was originally published by Agence France Presse, and the subsequent analysis was undertaken by the New York Times. Agence France Presse retracted the 4-missile version, saying that the image was apparently digitally altered by Iranian state media. So the last consideration in this section is that of the Greek finance minister Yanis Varoufakis and his finger incident, who allegedly showed the middle finger to a German audience. ZDF showed that video. It was a doctored video. It was fake. And later that faked video was released. Now, although this presentation is not primarily about green screen technology, the case of the ISIS video of the beheading of 2 Japanese journalists must be mentioned. And the reason is because of the polarized debate that these images and these videos create. So there's debate about whether they're real or faked. And which one is faked? Is it the green screen or is it the real image? So we can't say with any certainty of veracity which one is real. And now, finally, we enter the period of faked CGI news video stories, or do we? In 2015, ISIS released onto the World Wide Web a video supposedly showing the burning of a Jordanian Air Force pilot inside a metal cage. Within 24 hours, experts were claiming that the video was purely CGI, flames and cage around this pilot. The debate centered on the behavior of the flames, particularly those around the metal bars of the cage. And the perception was that the artifacts that were seen were due to CGI artifacts, whatever they might be. So in order to come to some insight or even conclusion about this debate, I conducted an experiment, because it was my hypothesis that the artifacts actually were compression artifacts. So a physical replication of intense flames and heat was generated around a real metal bar, and the video images were acquired at 1080 50i at 100 megabits per second. At 100 megabits per second, no artifacts were seen either. And the bit rate was then gradually reduced. At approximately 2 megabits per second, some blockiness appeared, and at half a megabit per second, the lateral displacement of the bars was observed in a similar aspect to the ISIS video. So what the conclusion is here is that we can say certainly that compression artifacts produce the same sorts of impression to viewers, but we don't know with any certainty because no experiment's been conducted with CGI flames under similar circumstances. So, when I first began to consider the implications for the use of generated video in television news context, I reviewed the research that had been undertaken, and to my surprise, there wasn't any that was specifically about CGI versus real images for both human viewers and computer vision. So I propose that what is needed is research that investigates video with camera versus CGI for both human and CV. Now, because people are increasingly finding it difficult to distinguish between real and photographic images, a number of studies have been conducted. This one is from 2016 by Dartford College, and what they found is that there's a bias towards assuming that an image is real and not computer generated. However, with training, with exposure to images, that percentage changes. So initially, photographic images were accurately identified 92% of the time, and CGI images accurately identified 60% of the time. With that training, interestingly, classifying photographs correctly reduced to 85%, and CGI images increased to 76%. So there are 4 important and relevant conclusions from this research. Subjects have a clear bias, as previously stated. Training reduces that bias. Advances in photorealistic rendering have made it increasingly difficult for subjects to distinguish between computer-generated images and real images. The images were relatively simple, they're just portraits. What needs to be investigated is if the images are more complex, say full body, where rendering becomes more difficult, does that give more visual cues to human observers to make assessments about what they're seeing? So the Narita study from the table in a few slides ago was useful to me because of the use of the Semantic Differential scale, which is a method for measuring connotative meaning of concepts as well as objects and events. So I did an exploratory study where 30 people watched a sequence of video that was a synthesis of live action and rendered CGI. And then they had to rate that sequence on just 5 factors. So these factors are color, depth perspective, motion, scene complexity, and resolution. And the Semantic Differential scale is about providing bipolar or polar adjective opposites at each end of the scale. And then the perception is rated, and the scale range is 1 to 9. And in best practice, the positive responses to factors should not all be on one side of the matrix. So, factor analysis with normal varimax rotation was then performed on the opinion scores to see if it's possible to reduce these 5 factors, in this instance, to a fewer number of factors. The factor loadings were computed, and the one obtained for motion was the highest. Now, this potentially means that this factor is the most important for human evaluation of CGI compared to real scenes for the video that was viewed. Now, next steps would be to evaluate more factors with appropriate adjective pairs. And concentrating for a moment on just motion, these factors might include angular motion, particularly rotation, how objects rotate, and the correlation of those pixels as the objects rotate. Linear motion predictability, motion that incorporates occlusion, relative motion between seen objects and objects moving at different depths in the scene. Part of this experiment was to get an impression of the viewer's real sense of realness or falseness, and the same scale was used. So the main purpose of this trial was to ascertain if the questions, the semantic differential scale, the bipolar adjectives, made sense to respondents. Correlation matrices were then computed using a MATLAB function, and the table on the next slide summarizes the findings, where overall impression is the factor for realness versus falseness question. So what we see here is that there's a strong correlation between a person's overall impression of realness or falseness and the factor score for motion. And the connotative meaning here is smoothness. This implies that the smoother the motion, the more the overall impression of realness. The second most significant correlation was depth. So for a given resolution and a given sequence, there's only been this one, the two most significant factors relating to overall impression seem to be the smoothness or jerkiness of the motion of objects and a good depth perspective. A second experiment was conducted, so just so to explain about this video, when it was shown to the respondents, it was running on a PC that had appropriate hardware acceleration, so you don't have all this stuttering. So what was done was two similar video sequences, one CGI and one camera acquired, were presented side by side. The video had a 640 by 360 pixel array at 25 frames per second. The real frames were acquired on a HD camera. A flammable liquid was ignited in a shallow tray in an unlit workshop, and AVC Intra 100 was how it was acquired. The video was then ingested to Premiere Pro and trimmed to 10-second duration to match the duration of the CGI flame sequence. The video was color corrected to better match the hue of the CGI flames, and the file was exported as DV 640 by 360, 25 frames a second, to match the spatial and temporal resolution of the CGI flames. Now the sample size of this test was 50 people, and they were asked to select which are the real flames, A or B. The respondents were aged from 17 to 78 and were a mix of experts and non-experts, equal numbers by gender. 52% stated that video B was the sequence of camera-acquired flames, and 48% thought that it was A. The answer is B is the camera-acquired sequence. In addition to the quantitative data, qualitative analysis was undertaken, which was to try and see what the differences in perception are.
This is the experiment.
Okay. A ghostly voice. Okay. Was it real, or was it? So, one of the things that we were looking for is differences and similarities. So the similarity that people stated was most obvious to them, obviously, was the colour. They wanted to eliminate colour as a factor for discrimination. The difference was the motion, the flicker, how they behaved, guided some people towards choosing the correct answer. So, some initial observations about human visual perception and how we, at a high level, are looking, at a semantic level, we're looking at CGI versus real. Now, in terms of computer vision, one of the aspects that's guided me towards the concept of optical flow as a potential measure of discriminating between real and CGI is the human perception that motion is very important to a sense of realness. These results haven't been finalised yet, but the quantitative data hasn't been fully analysed, but at a visual level, looking at the sequences with the overlay of the optical flow vectors, there does appear to be differences in the behaviour of the real versus the CGI flames. And I propose that this is potentially meaningful for computer vision systems. Other possibilities for computer vision to take a look at what's happening with real versus CGI is depth analysis, and in fact probably a multimodal approach of optical flow and depth analysis. And more recently, with machine intelligence, the semantic scene analysis. Some recent results about how machine vision is determining the relationship between real objects in a real scene is very promising. One of the things that I want to bring your attention to before I come to my conclusion is that we know that there are fake news websites out there. A lot of them come from Macedonia. So what is the motivation at this moment in time for fake news? Why is it being done? Well, one potential is monetization, is clickbait. Create these fake stories. Everybody wants to find out what Hillary Clinton or somebody else has done, Jeremy Corbyn in the UK. And what I'm suggesting is that if we look beyond text, false text that's supported by real images, sometimes taken out of context, and we enter a world where these fake news stories are supported by generated images, then we're going to be in a world of real uncertainty. And the people that want to believe these stories have even more reason to believe them, and they create more polarized debate. So, what are the issues? When we were in a simplistic world, by the way, it didn't last for very long. If you look at when the chemical photographic image was invented or developed, and that first faked image didn't last very long. We didn't live in a world where the real image, used as real, allowed us that trust with that media. When a fake image is known to be faked, again, there's trust. But when we operate in this world of real images used as fake or faked images used as real, we have distrust. We have epistemological issues. The very nature of knowledge is being challenged. So, talking a little bit more about motivation, this isn't just about broadcasting. It affects our community, but it affects the world as we see it as a whole. And governments are paying attention to how this is used as propaganda. When I interviewed the ex-head of the counter-terrorism branch in London about the implications for this, and we looked at what the motivation might be, he quite simply said, simply because we can. So these challenges of examples of historical examples of photographs and videos in a television news context that have been faked creates polarized debates. That's one of the primary issues. We don't know where we stand. Now, this poses a challenge as to how broadcasters and viewers relate with television news in the future. We've seen that at this moment in time, we're not quite there yet with photorealism, but when I talk to people who are working in this field, they really do believe there will be a time when it is indistinguishable. So, in looking forwards, I'm reminded of the past, and in particular the comments by Marshall McLuhan. He said, "I've always been very careful never to predict anything that had not already happened. The future is not what it used to be. So therefore, in declaring my hypothesis about faked-generated moving images being used in a television news context, the antecedents for this had, of course, already happened through faked scrolls, proclamations, texts, books, art, photographic still images, sound recordings, frames in motion picture film, digital stills photography, and now CGI animation. It's only a matter of time until video in a television news context is thrust upon us where not a single photon, a single pixel, a single line, a single frame, or a single sound has ever existed in the real world. And so ultimately, with respect to television, seeing may no longer be believing. Thank you.
Ed Roden, Department of Defense. I want to make a few comments. Number one, I've been looking into this too from a different point of view. So first, I'm going to compliment you. I never looked at it from the aspect, can a human tell the difference? All I'm concerned is, can I detect the difference? And I have access to every computer in the world to look at it. There is a program called Metaphor that the U.S. government is doing. They've got about $40 million to develop software to look at video and still frames. Their goal is now 35,000 images or videos a day that they have to look at.
Yep.
So they're throwing a lot of resources at it.
Yep.
And last year at this show, I did a presentation on detecting modified video. Again, I'm looking at, can a computer detect it?
Yep.
So we know. You're looking at, can a human detect it?
Yeah, mostly.
So I
yes.
compliment you on that.
Yeah, thank you.
And then I just want to throw one other point. During your talk, there was a press release that the government, at the State Department, did release a faked photo as a news story, and the news broke.
What, today?
During your talk.
Is that for real or is that
Yes,
fake?
we can show you. I can show you the news clip because it's on my wife's cell phone.
I'd love
right?
to look at that with you after this presentation.
Right, I'd love to join you over at lunch.
Yes, thank you.
Now I'm going to give you one more thought. The Brady photographs taken at the Gettysburg battle during the Civil War, there are a lot of them are faked.
Yeah,
So now we're back to 1864.
yeah. 1864. Yeah.
Right, so you can move your calendar back a little earlier.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, likewise, it was a great talk, important topic. So I also just want to mention, for people interested in this topic, Holly Rushmeyer's lab has a recent paper looking at humans' ability to notice lighting inconsistencies in image compositing.
Yes.
And yeah, we don't do very well, sadly. But my question is more detailed. So you have the semantic differential method.
Yes.
And you had the, for the axis of realness and falseness. So I wonder if that might put a bias in the responses. For example, if you showed Mona Lisa and, you know, it's a synthetic image, a human-made image, but a lot of people wouldn't want to assign the value term false to that. So I don't know if that maybe it might be worth thinking that axis a little more carefully.
Yes, thank you for that. I will.
Keith Graham, consultant. Despite the nearness of this conference to Halloween, it's not often that I come to SMPTE and get really scared by listening to papers. But 2 papers ago in that room was a presentation showing how they can synthesize mouth movements to speech and superimpose it on multiple versions. They used President Obama and a piece of his speech, and they took 4 completely different positions of him and synthesized the same speech, and it looked remarkably accurate. The sooner you can get to some method that will identify what has been done to this sort of thing and label it as fake, the better. Because when you see it on a small screen, and most people will be watching these sort of things on cell phones and tablets, those little visual clues are going to get lost in the resolution of the screen.
Indeed. And some of the things that are going on at the moment, those visual cues, for non-experts are very difficult to discriminate. Interestingly, when I was doing my work, I showed some of the sequences that I was working with to an expert in avionics. And the side-by-side comparison of a real fighter jet compared against a CGI fighter jet, to him, he immediately looked at it and said, oh, I know which one of those is real. And it was because of the behavior in the real world, because fighter jets are inherently unstable, and the way they flip is a particular attribute of the avionics. So he could tell, but most people can't tell. So I think one of the mechanisms by which we may, at the time being, be able to deal with this is by experts in particular fields analysing video. So it's not so much about general visual cues, it's about the experience that they've learned about how objects behave, possibly.
Yes, and the fact that most people will believe whatever they're given, which is why the National Enquirer has such a good circulation. People are quite happy to believe whatever they see there. Thank you.
Thank you.
I mean, it's not true. Provocative and unfortunately sobering. I just wanted to offer an observation, not a question, that the other thing I'm seeing increasingly is you can take real elements, real facts, but the way you put them together in a narrative can lead to a fake conclusion.
Yes.
And I'm beginning to see more and more of that, and now added with some of these elements of faking news. The other observation is what happens when the bad guys get all these AI tools as well, and they use AI to make better fake images. So we have that to worry. And hopefully Ed's going to fix that before it happens.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Martyn.
Thank you.